Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, that you can just go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions you have, especially because recently there hasn't been as much questions, and hate to say it, but some of your guys' questions have not exactly been the most interesting. So I want to try to challenge you guys to think of some really interesting questions, try to really challenge me, and think of something that hasn't been asked yet. And if you do, I'll make sure to answer your question, even if it doesn't get voted up by everyone else. And if you have a question that you really want answered, then don't worry about if it's interesting or not. Go ahead and post it. I'll answer it. So guys, don't worry too much about this. But I'm just saying, I want to see what you guys can do. So, think of some cool questions and post them for me for the next Q&A. And also, just one other thing that I wanted to say before I actually jumped into answering questions was that I think I talked about in a previous Q&A how recently I've just been drinking decaf coffee. I'm actually drinking decaf coffee right now, but recently I was drinking decaf coffee because once I started drinking decaf coffee, my tolerance to caffeine went down, and I started to be able to feel a little bit of the kind of caffeine boost you feel when you drink caffeine just from the decaf. So I figured, what's the point of drinking a full cup of coffee, because it makes you kind of jittery and kind of elevates your heart level and things like that. But I recently found out about this, I guess you could call it a nootropic, this substance called L-theanine. And some of you guys might already know about this, but L-theanine is this amino acid that's found only in green tea, I think. And it just makes you feel relaxed, but also alert, kind of like you're in a meditative state. And it's completely harmless. You can't overdose on it. There's no negative health effects, and you can just buy it in the store or on the internet. It's totally legal. And a lot of people take it with caffeinated coffee, or I should say they take it with caffeine, because when you take this L-theanine and caffeine, there's this really nice synergistic effect where you get kind of the benefits of caffeine without the downsides. So you get the boost in alertness and concentration, but you don't get the kind of jitteriness and elevated heart rate and things like that. And so lately I've been doing that, and it's really awesome. So if you're curious, maybe check it out. It might be good for immersion, but also do your own research. Don't just put stuff in your body because I told you to. So with that said, let's jump into the questions. So Nick asks, "Hey Matt, it's clear that listening to audio of speakers in a more casual setting with more room for mumbling, like a podcast like Hiikibiiki or a show like Terrace House, would be more difficult than listening to more enunciated audio, like a scripted show or movie. Though, not necessarily without any mumbling, as that'd be near impossible to find. And this is because you'd not only have to learn unknown words, but also how mumbling and slurring words affect speech." Well, that was all one sentence. You should try to use more periods, man. So my question is, would you say that listening to this more casual audio has less value until you know most of the common words, say until you've reached stage 2 or 3? Or would you say that it has just as much value early on? Yeah, so it's definitely true that kind of scripted forms of content such as such as dramas and maybe animes and movies and things like that do tend to feature more enunciated speech as compared to unscripted media such as maybe YouTube videos or podcasts and things like that. And yeah, of course, in general, it's easier to understand people when they're enunciating more than when they're mumbling more. But I'd say that there's a lot of other factors we have to take into account in order to answer your question. So first of all, in more natural type speech, like the type of speech you're likely to hear in a podcast or in a YouTube video, the range of vocabulary that's going to be used tends to be extremely limited. When we're actually just having everyday conversations with friends or family, we generally only use around, I've heard, the most common 1,000, 2,000 words. And so we're not going to be using big fancy synonyms in order to try to sound eloquent or smart and things like that. But when we're talking about scripted forms of media, like a movie or a drama, things tend to be more cinematic, more theatrical. And so a lot of times you're going to end up hearing kind of grammar structures and vocabulary that often you wouldn't really hear in daily life and are a little less common. And so in a way, we have to, each side has something going for it and something going against it. So if we're talking about the scripted media, it's very enunciated, that helps, but they're going to use lots of perhaps unfamiliar words and structures that makes it harder to understand. Then when we have the daily real life natural speech like podcasts and YouTube videos, then yeah, they're going to be mumbling more, that makes it harder to understand, but on the other hand, they're using very limited range of vocabulary. And so in a vacuum, I don't think you can say that one is necessarily better than the other. I think it more depends on what you want to focus on early on. Because in a way, the mumbling, I don't think, when you really think about the big picture, that it's that much of an obstacle. You mentioned the podcast Hiikibiiki, and just for anyone who doesn't know, this is apparently a podcast that's very popular amongst Japanese learners because it contains fairly accessible language. It's pretty easy to understand. I had heard about it before, but I never actually had listened to it until like a couple minutes ago, because another question in this Q&A mentions Hiikibiiki and asks about it. So I went and listened to it. But in like podcasts like that, really, I mean, yeah, you might be able to say they're not enunciating quite as much as something like a drama or a movie, but really it's pretty close. Like they're definitely not, I wouldn't say mumbling or slurring. Like, yeah, sometimes people slur their speech. Like, for example, if I was going to be in English, be like, oh, yeah, I mean, I'm going to go to the store tomorrow, and, oh, yeah, anything you need me to get it when I'm at the store? Like, some people talk like that. Yeah, that's going to be hard to understand. But people in this podcast, they're speaking pretty clearly. And a lot of times also in movies, there is going to be scenes where people are mumbling. Like, you know, police in Japanese movies, they tend to mumble. Old people always mumble. So a lot of times you might even hear more mumbling in certain movie scenes than in shows like this. Now, in Terrace House in particular, I'd say, yeah, there is a lot of mumbling just because you have a lot of younger people who probably don't pay that much attention to the way they speak. And so, yeah, there's a lot of mumbling that happens, but it's not a huge amount. And so ultimately, I don't think that the mumbling is a huge obstacle. Although, like you said in your question, it is something that you have to get used to. And so if you are someone who is mainly focused on real life, daily conversational Japanese, and you really want to get out and be talking to people as soon as possible, or maybe just the content that you're interested in tends to be more focused towards YouTube things or podcasts and things like that, then I would say just maybe focus on that more natural, unscripted, real life stuff right from the start. And very early on, your brain will figure out how to adapt to the mumbling that happens, and you'll be fine. On the other hand, if you're someone who is planning to mainly learn through media, like anime and drama and movies and things like that, this is basically what I did, then you can just focus on that, and you won't have the obstacle of mumbling, but instead you'll have to deal with the obstacle of tons of new vocabulary, a seemingly never-ending flow of new vocabulary that you have to learn in order to continue to grow your comprehension to the higher levels. And so there's kind of different challenges, kind of like pick your challenge. Overall, I recommend people to go in the direction of watching more of the scripted type of media, just because when you have a series like an ongoing drama or anime or something with an ongoing narrative, then a lot of times that can be very comprehensible to a learner because, well, first of all, you can tell what's happening on screen because you have the visuals, and so, you know, there's a lot of times you could watch certain episodes of certain dramas with the sound off, and you'd still have a pretty good idea of what was happening within the story. But also, when there's many episodes, then you get to know the characters, and this can make it easy to follow the plot and things like that. So in general, dramas and anime are very easy to learn from. Whereas if you're talking about a podcast, that's fairly inaccessible to a beginner because there's no visual component. So you really might you could listen to a whole podcast, you might have literally no idea what they were even talking about, like what the topic of conversation even was. And so in that sense, it's harder to learn from real life things. And I mean, real life meaning natural unscripted things. And a podcast is an extreme because there's literally no visual component. But even if you're talking about a YouTube video where someone's standing in front of the camera and talking, if they're just sitting there and talking the whole time, again, the visuals that you're getting, which is their face and their mouth moving, is not going to be directly related to the contents of what they're talking about. Whereas in a drama or a movie or an anime, the audio that you're going to be hearing, the speech you're going to be hearing, is going to be directly related to what's happening on screen. So that's really what makes it comprehensible. It's not just that there technically is a visual component to stare at. And so I would say, yeah, overall, it's just, as a language learner, it's going to be easier to learn from things with a visual component that gives you hints as to what's being said. And those tend to happen in the drama, anime, movie realm. So I would say, yeah, for most people, I would recommend that, but depends on who you are. Because for some people, they might really just not be interested in learning from that type of media. And they need to, like, the only content that's really engaging for them that they're interested in is things like podcasts or YouTube videos or real life. So for those people, I'd say, yeah, just do it. But I guess the overall message that's true for everyone is you probably want to choose a certain domain and stick with it, at least for a while. Because, yeah, it's true, the type of language that's used in scripted media is different than the type of language that's used in unscripted media. And at the beginning, you have nothing to work with. And so you want to make things as easy for yourself as possible. And a really good way to do that is to limit the domain. So a lot of times, like, not only would I recommend limiting yourself to scripted media, but maybe even to specific genres within scripted media. Like maybe you only watch romance and comedy shows for a while. And that's going to help you get familiar with the vocabulary and type of language used in that domain, help you build a base. Once you have the base, you can spread out. I've talked about this before. So yeah, I'd say it's useful to limit your domain, and which domain you choose depends on what your priorities are and who you are. But I kind of hopefully explained how you should make that decision. So yeah, Matt A asks, if my goal is to speak my target language with my kids, would you recommend I focus my immersion on media where there are family interactions, such as family dramas or series about families? Any other recommendations for how to achieve this goal? So basically, your main goal for learning your target language is to interact with your family. So should you actually watch content that features family interactions? And I would say not necessarily, because when you really think about what types of conversations and what types of language gets used in family interactions, I don't think it's necessarily that different than the types of conversations you have and the type of language that you use when you're talking to just a friend, a coworker on the inside of the elevator, some random person who you sit next to on the bus if you happen to strike up a conversation. Really, in all these situations, you're mainly just using normal, everyday, conversational language. And I don't think it would really be that helpful to try to draw a distinction between the type of conversation that you have, with your coworker on the elevator and the type of conversation that you have, with your wife or with your kid or with your husband or whatever. And so I think you probably should limit yourself to domains that feature everyday, natural, normal language. So, romance shows would be good, comedy shows would be good, shows that feature the workplace would be good, shows that feature school would be good, anything like that. So probably not things like science fiction, fantasy, documentaries about World War II, or anything like that. That probably would be not as helpful for your goal. But I'd say there's no need to limit it all to family interactions, because really, I think most people, there's this phenomenon called motherese or whatever, where mothers speak to their infants in this very unique, weird, high-pitched, extremely exaggerated voice, like, oh, hey, you're so cute, or whatever. So if you're trying to do that, you're trying to learn how to do that, then maybe, yeah, immerse in that type of content, but that doesn't really sound like what you're talking about. So if you even think about it, even after your kids are 2, 3, 4 years old, you mainly just talk to them like they're a person, right? Like, there's nothing, maybe you go out of your way to not use too many difficult words. Maybe you speak a little more clearly, or you try to just, kind of tailor the way that you speak to them a little bit. But for the most part, you're just speaking to them like a normal person. And as long as you master everyday normal conversation, then you'll be able to tailor your speech for children the same way that you would do in your native language, right? Because you're going to know what words tend to be more common and more simple. You're going to know that speaking more slowly helps. You're going to know what concepts the children are likely to understand and be familiar with. So yeah, realistically, I think just focus on everyday normal conversation, and you'll have the family stuff covered. It'll kind of come along with that automatically. But you can watch stuff with family interactions. There's no reason not to. That will help. But I'm just saying, there's no real reason to only limit yourself to that. I don't think that would necessarily be more productive than just watching shows that feature everyday natural language in general. So Ganizmit asks, why certain sounds in Japanese are not consistent? especially ra and na-ro, for example. So da na sounds like so da ra. Honmono sounds like honmoro. Tabaneta sounds like tabareta, and sometimes ri even sounds like me. Do you always convert sounds in your head based on context, like ra equals na? P.S. I noticed you also produced that sound in your old Jigo Shoukai Poi doga. He has a link. One more example. And then he posts 2 more examples. So yeah, he has a link to a sound clip from, it sounds like they were taken from anime. And so first of all, so I listened to the 2 sound clips that you posted, and to me, they both sound completely normal. Every sound that they're saying sounds like the sound that they're saying. It doesn't sound like there's any inconsistencies happening. So I'll just say that up front. If I remember, I'll try to edit in the actual sound clips into this video so you guys can hear them.
おばんです。なるほどなるほど。すまない。
But a few things to say here. So first of all, you ask, why are certain sounds in Japanese not consistent? Well, I could ask you the same question. Why would they be consistent? You know, that's just an assumption that you have that they should be consistent. But, you know, human language is very complicated. Most things are not as simple as you might initially assume that they would be. So, you know, if you've seen my video on my channel called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language, in that video, I actually talk about how in English, we have a lot of sound changes that occur naturally. Like, for example, when you say, don't you want to go to the store, for example, in a lot of places within the United States, people pronounce that as don't you want to go to the store, don't ya. So don't and you become don't you. So the CH sound, the ch and don't you, just comes out of nowhere, right? It's not a product of the like don't and you. It kind of arises out of nowhere. Why does this happen? Well, that's, you know, maybe some linguist who studied the in-depth like evolution of how and why language changes over time, maybe they could come up with an explanation as to why. But for the most part, you know, language is a very complicated system with many different interactions, and there's always a lot of factors at play, so it's hard to really know. But from a language learner's point of view, it's kind of something you just got to accept. You know, you just got to accept that depending on what dialect or accent of English that you're learning, when you say don't you got to say don't you, because that's what native speakers do, and your job is to speak like how they speak. So to a certain extent, that's just how it is. So yeah, I can't really give you a good explanation as to why. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why these sound changes happen is because it makes it easier to speak. It makes things more economical from a physical energy point of view. Like, you know, saying like don't you want to go physically takes less movement of your tongue and mouth than saying don't you want to go. And so I think that's a big factor at play. And maybe the reasons why the sounds change when you shove them together is because that makes it easier to identify when people are speaking quickly. That would just be a guess. But anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of random stuff like that in languages. And I noticed this happening in Japanese as well. And one of the kind of negative, I guess, side effects of Japanese not being as popular of a language as English is in English, you can just look up the rules for these type of sound changes and read about all the different ones that exist. I covered a bunch of them in that video that I made called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language. And then you can listen for them and get better at noticing them and stuff. But for Japanese, I've never seen any resource that actually explains the different sound changes that happen on this kind of consonant vowel level. And I've noticed some, like one particular example that I noticed a little while ago was that I was listening to a natural, like a Japanese person who was born and raised in Tokyo, just speak off the cuff. And he said, "Sonna ki ga shimasu." So he was trying to basically say like, "Sonna ki ga shimasu." But instead of saying ki ga shimasu, the ga almost had a Y sound. It was like ki ya shimasu. So, "Sonna ki ga shimasu." And when I heard that, at first, I just instantly understood it and it just sounded supernatural. But it was only because I was paying very close attention to the actual sounds he was saying that I noticed, oh, that wasn't actually a G sound, that was a Y sound. And so if you just continue to learn a language through immersion, you'll naturally acquire all the little sound changes. So your brain will naturally figure out, without you even consciously realizing it, that in certain specific cases in Japanese, for example, a G sound can be pronounced like a Y sound. And so I could have understood. So I've probably been hearing Japanese people say kiyashimasu with the Y sound for years. But it was only a couple months ago that I first consciously recognized that it was a Y sound, not a G sound in this situation. So on an understanding level, this type of thing is not a problem. It's just a matter of mass listening. And then eventually your brain figures it out pretty easily. I never really struggled with that. And so that's, I think, again, a similar thing to what I said in English a little bit ago, where it's making the act of speaking more economical. Like saying "son kiga shimasu" actually takes more physical movement and energy than saying "kiyashimasu." Your tongue has to move less. So I think these type of changes naturally come about because people are lazy and people are trying to, we're programmed as living beings to conserve as much energy as possible. So I think it's a natural result of that. And a lot of times these things are context-based, because if you're listening to a voice actor read a script, they usually tend to hyper-enunciate, and they're not going to do these types of shortcuts, right? They're probably going to say, "sonna kiga shimasu," or something like that. So yeah, a lot of these smaller ones are context-dependent. And there's other things in Japanese where the sounds definitely do change, but it's not necessarily to be more economical. It's more like because it just changes the impression that it gives off. So one thing you'll hear a lot in anime is like, instead of saying yaru, they'll say yara. And you'll even sometimes see this reflected in manga, where they'll be like, kimete ra. And you'll actually see that they'll write like ya and then ra and then like a small a. And so they will actually reflect that in the kana. And this has a certain sound of like being a kind of like rascal, like a kind of anime type of character, like a shonen anime main character type of feel to it. And so I don't think in real life people do this unless they're like joking and being ironic. But that's just one example of like sounds can change. And so, yeah, I think there'll be other sound changes like that depend on the dialect of Japanese. Different regional dialects might pronounce some sounds differently. And some just different character archetypes or different styles of speaking might pronounce some things differently. So that type of thing happens. And but another thing is, before you get really, really good at listening, a lot of times your brain will just misinterpret sounds. So I remember there were times where it happened to me where it would sound like someone was saying one sound, and I'd ask my Japanese friend or something, and they'd say that it was a different sound, and I couldn't hear it. It was like, let's just say in your example, right? You're saying that sometimes a na might sound like a ra. And so for me, it really sounded like a ra, but to him, it sounded like a na. And I was like, what is going on here? And now maybe if I were to go back and listen to that, it would actually now sound like a na to me. And I think a lot of this is that when throughout the process of your brain, listening to language and interpreting it and transforming it into meaning, the initial signal that the actual sound waves that hit your ear that then get sent to your brain and get interpreted, there's a certain amount of noise mixed into the signal. And so your brain has to use the kind of blurry kind of, initial data that it gets and try to sort out what's noise, what's signal, and rely on context clues to figure it out and stuff like that. And so when you're really fluent, when you're like native level, your brain is really good at this. And so it can basically determine like, oh yeah, no, this is supposed to be an end, or like a na sound, not a da sound. But maybe the initial signal that actually hit your ear, it wasn't na or da. It was just such a blurry signal because it had so much noise mixed in that it wasn't clear which one it was at all. And your brain had to kind of rely on context or maybe just make its best guess or something. And so the closer you are to native, or the better you are in language, the better guesses that your brain makes. And when you're at a lower level, sometimes your brain will just guess wrong. And the thing is, this guessing of what sounds you're hearing, this happens at the level of the unconscious. Watch my video called, I think it's Language Acquisition and Consciousness, on my main channel, if you want to kind of learn more about what I'm talking about here, or hear more of my thoughts on this type of thing. But yeah, basically a lot of the process of understanding language happens below the level of consciousness. So by the time any amount of language actually reaches your consciousness and you become aware of it, it's already been highly processed by your unconscious mind. So when you hear that na sound or that da sound, you're not hearing the actual raw sound wave that entered your ear. You're hearing a very more interpreted, conceptually overlaid version of the initial sound wave. And so if it sounds like a ra to you, but it's really a na, that might just be because your brain's process of analyzing the sound, interpreting the sound, is not yet at the level of a native speaker. And so as you just continue to listen to the language for, hundreds of thousands of hours, and you get better at listening, just your brain will naturally get better at interpreting these sounds, and eventually a lot of these issues that you're having will just naturally go away, and things will just, to you subjectively, they'll sound the way that they're supposed to sound. And that's why I think for me, the 2 clips that you sent, when I listen to them, they sound completely normal. I can't hear any sound sounding like something besides what I think it should sound like. So basically, I guess to conclude, there's a lot of this is actually that, sounds change depending on the context. And some of it is that your brain might just be misinterpreting the sounds, and really they are consistent, but your brain is kind of warping them because it doesn't have enough level of perceptual accuracy yet. But that will go away naturally. And you might find it frustrating that there are these 2 possibilities and you don't know which one a certain thing might be. So maybe you run into something that sounds inconsistent. You're not sure if you're just hearing it incorrectly or if it's actually a sound change. But that's just something that basically you'll have to let be for a while, because you kind of have to wait until you have a very high level of perceptual accuracy before you'll really ever be able to be sure that something that you're hearing is indeed a sound shift and not a misperception or something. But all that stuff will work itself out over time as you get better, and I wouldn't worry about it too much. So let me drink some coffee. So Fukai Mori asks, "Hi Matt, I would like to know your thoughts on some seemingly contradictory advice for a person in my situation. I'm learning French, and my goal is to be able to function well in French society and interact with others in French. Perhaps a 3.5 on your spectrum of language ability. My current level allows me to constantly spot words and short sentences in movies/TV shows, but in more conversational media, such as YouTube or Twitch, the comprehension goes down significantly. You've also mentioned that content with an ongoing narrative, like animes or dramas, can be easier and a good choice for a beginner. However, you've also mentioned that you should practice what you play. I think you said you should practice like you play, is what I like to say. My question is this: should I focus on immersing in content that's easier to understand, or content that is more similar to what I need to understand, or what I need to understand to succeed at my goal? So yeah, coincidentally, this is along pretty similar lines as the first question that I answered in this video. So I'll kind of assumed, if you're listening to this answer, I'll assume you listened to the first answer I gave in this video, just so I don't have to repeat myself. And so basically you're saying that what your real goal is, and the thing that interests you, is real life style speech, like you hear in real life conversations on Twitch, on YouTube, and so on. But you've said, but the easiest thing to learn from is scripted media like anime or dramas and things like that. And so do you pick the one that's more relevant to your actual goals, or do you pick the one that is going to make for the smoothest path to fluency? And I would say it depends on kind of your final goal and your long-term plan. So I'd say there's 2 possibilities. If the only thing that you care about is functioning in French society and interacting with French people, and even if you can never really understand more sophisticated like dramas and movies and things like that, because those types of things will contain a larger range of vocabulary and grammatical structures that almost never come up in real life. So if you're okay with never really understanding that, and the only thing that you care about is real life speech, then I would say, yeah, just go directly to your final goal and focus on the real life speech. And yeah, it will be a little bit harder at first, but it will save you time in the end, because there's no point in taking the anime path or the drama, movie, the scripted path, if the only point of that is that it's a stepping stone to get to your final goal. You can jump straight to your final goal. You'll struggle and it will be a little more challenging, but it will take a smaller amount of total time in the end. On the other hand, if your final goal is to be able to do anything in French, but it just so happens that out of all the things that you can do, the ones that you're most interested in are interacting with French people and French society and stuff like that, then I would say, and the other thing is that if you're thinking on a longer time scale and you don't mind that it's going to take you longer to get to your final goal as long as the result is good, then I would say maybe you should take the anime path, because if you want to be able to kind of understand anything in the end and your final goal is to understand everything, then you might as well just tackle things in order of what is easiest to tackle next. So you could get really good at things with an ongoing narrative like anime and drama, which would be pretty natural and easy to learn from. And then after that, you could jump into more real life content like Twitch streams and things like that. And if you already have a strong foundation that you built through the scripted type of content, then when you eventually do jump over to real life content, there's not going to be very much of a gap to bridge. It's going to be pretty quick and easy for you to make that transition. And so overall, this would be the quickest path to understanding everything. So it really comes down to, is the fact that you might never really be good at the scripted type of stuff, like, are you okay with that? And but on the other hand, if you do want to understand everything, are you okay with it taking you longer to get to your final goal? So I think, yeah, it more kind of just comes down to what is your final goal and what is your timeline like, and it kind of depends on that. So Chefs15 asks, would you recommend the Japanese graded readers for immersion at an early level? If not, what other resources would you recommend? So Japanese graded readers are all capitalized. I mean, the first letter of each of those three words are capitalized, which tells me that this is probably pointing to a specific brand or a specific series of Japanese graded readers. And I've never heard of that before. I've never seen them before, so I can't comment on this specific series of graded readers exactly, but I can speak broadly about my current thoughts on graded readers. So my personal preference would be to not use graded readers. I never used graded readers, and if I could go back and relearn Japanese again, I still wouldn't use graded readers, and I'm not using graded readers in my Chinese studies. What my preference is to basically learn the basics of reading through watching content with target language subtitles, and then jump into real authentic content. Real authentic reading content like books, novels, things that are actually interesting to me and aren't dumbed down in any way. And I like to take this path just because, for me, I get just really turned off by trying to consume any piece of content which is inauthentic, which was dumbed down for the sake of a learner or meant for children. It just isn't as exciting for me, because for me, one of the most exciting things about language learning is that you're understanding something that was meant for real native speakers, right? It's real and it's authentic, yet you're understanding it. Maybe you're only understanding 5% of it, but that 5% that you're understanding, that's 5% of real authentic content. And so for me, that's just always going to be a high priority. And I know that you can learn from stuff that's made for natives from the beginning. And, you know, my ability to tolerate ambiguity is very high. I trained that through learning Japanese. And so for me, I can watch a show in Chinese with Chinese subtitles, and maybe I only understand a very small amount of it, but I still understand as much as I understand, and I'm still constantly pushing my cutting edge forward and understanding more each day. So for me, there's just no real reason to use graded readers. And that's why, for the most part, I've never really recommended that to anybody. But I also understand, and I understand a lot more than I used to, that for some people, this path of jumping into native media from the start and tolerating the ambiguity and just being okay with the fact that you might be understanding less than 50%. Although I still recommend that you go out of your way to choose content that's relatively comprehensible, and there's other criteria I give. So it's not like I'm saying, like, right off the start, jump into some like super difficult science fiction audiobook or something. That's not going to be very helpful. But but I still do recommend that, you're placing a certain amount of importance on comprehensibility, but you're not giving it all like ultimate authority or ultimate importance. At the end of the day, you're trying to balance what's going to be interesting to you and what's intriguing and engaging to you, and how comprehensible it is. And so, so that's my recommendation. But I know that for some people, it just doesn't really work very well. The fact that they can't understand a lot is just really frustrating, and they would much prefer to just read something that was dumbed down, but almost completely comprehensible, and use those type of resources as basically a tool to build more of a strong foundation. And after they build that foundation, then they will, after that, jump into native media and not have to deal with the ambiguity as much. So for some people, like Steve Kaufman, I'm pretty sure this is his main approach, and it's more of the kind of the more common mainstream approach. Like if you talk to people that are kind of in between mainstream language learning and the kind of immersion kind of stuff that we talk about at MIA, a lot of time that's their approach, is like, yeah, use textbooks and beginner materials and graded readers to build a basic foundation and then jump into the real stuff. And I think that works. I think it's fine. It's just not really my personal preference. But if you're the type of person who would rather read something like read a graded reader that's kind of boring and kind of inauthentic, but is very comprehensible, then watch something that's interesting and authentic, but you only understand like 10%, then yeah, I think that's fine. The only thing you have to be careful with is not spending too much time in that dumbed down, inauthentic content. I think, you gotta know when to just make the jump into the deep end of the pool and get out of the kiddie pool, because the trap is you just continue to read these dumbed down baby resources forever, and you're just waiting for you to get good enough to jump into real content. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's always going to be a jump, right? The first time that you actually read a real book that was meant for native speakers, it's going to be challenging, and no amount of preparation is going to get you to the point where it's not a challenge. So you got to know when to pull the plug and jump into real content. But of course, reading a few graded readers or building up a foundation through that is definitely going to make a big difference and help if that's what you choose to do. So I would say, yeah, if you want to take that graded reader path, I'd say try to find one that's as interesting as you can find. You don't want to be too bored, or you're not going to spend a lot of time doing it. And if you're doing that, still do audio immersion and try to immerse yourself in authentic audio content, because of course reading isn't going to help your listening ability at all. And yeah, I think there's not much else to say on that one. So Kamazats asks, oh yeah, one other thing I just want to say is that, yeah, so I don't have any recommendations about specific Japanese readers because I've never looked at one ever. But maybe in the future I'll check some out and then get to the point where I have some recommendations. Have a lot of resistance to doing that just because for the longest time, I was just such not a fan of the graded readers. And I think you could tell, like, as I was talking, I was realizing, like, I'm saying that I think it's fine to use graded readers and that that's actually going to be a better choice for some people, yet I'm clearly using disparaging language talking about them. So yeah, I'm aware that I'm doing that, and I think that's just my old conditioning, my old age-at days. The conditioning from my old age-at days where I just hated anything inauthentic with a passion. But I am coming around. I am recognizing that, although I hate to admit it, that is going to be a better path for some people. And so, yeah, in the future, I'll probably look into that a little more, have some more specific recommendations, and try to not be as subtly disparaging when I talk about them. So if you're a fan of graded readers and I insulted you, I apologize. So Kamazats asks, have you ever tried meditating in a float tank? Yeah, I have. It was pretty interesting. It was a good time. Yannick Hiraro asks, hi, Matt. When it comes to Tango N5 and N4, what would you recommend to do when reviewing? Have two card types, one with only audio on the front and one with only text, and try to understand the card in each format? For example, when a text card appears, if I got the meaning but don't recall the reading, it's okay, and vice versa. I have a hard time recalling the reading most of the time. So what I would say is just rep the deck as text cards and have one card for each note. So what you're saying here, you kind of propose this idea of you'll have 2 cards for each note, if you actually can remember that Anki terminology, but you know what I mean, right? For each sentence, you have 2 cards for each sentence. One of them's an audio card, one of them's a text card. And on the text card, as long as you get the meaning, then you can mark the card okay, even if you forget the reading. But the problem with this is, in order to actually read a book, you have to know how all the words are read, right? So if you're marking cards correct, even though you don't know the reading, then you might run into the issue where when you're actually reading a book, you're also not going to be able to recall readings. And that's going to be an issue. And just because you can understand something spoken, that doesn't mean that you can, like, if we have a word, like let's say the word nihon. So just because if someone says the word nihon, you can understand it, that doesn't mean that when you see the kanji for nihon, you can remember the reading. So you got to think about, well, what is everything I need in order to like fully read a book? I mean, you could argue that to read a book, you don't need to know the readings, but I mean, when we read a book, we are pronouncing all the text in our head. It's called subvocalization. There's research that trying to remove subvocalization drastically reduces your comprehension of text. And as a learner, I think you want to know how kanji are read. It's pretty important. So I would say, if you want to know readings when you read, then you have to make sure that when you're doing text cards, you are testing that you know the readings, because you have to make sure that you can do the skill that you're trying to train. But anyway, ultimately, I'd say it's not really worth it to have 2 cards for every sentence, because that's going to be twice as many reps. Hold on, I'm really thirsty. That's going to be twice as many reps. And of course, each rep is going to be easier, because if you have 2 cards for every sentence, you're going to get very familiar with those sentences. And so, of course, each rep is going to be easier. But still, you're going to have a ton of reps. And I don't think that you're going to get enough benefit to justify doing all of those extra reps and ultimately spending all that extra time on Anki. So really, I would say you want to either have all text cards or all audio cards. And I would say that for most people, you want to choose all text cards, because at the beginning, when you're first doing the Tango decks, that's if you're following the like MIA overview, then you just finished recognition RTK, and so you just learned how to recognize the kanji. So the next step is now you want to start learning how to read words that are in kanji. And so if you finish the RTK deck and then you just start doing audio cards, and you're not really testing yourself on whether or not you can recall the readings and meanings of words that are written in kanji, then you're not really going to be taking the next step when it comes to cultivating your kanji ability, right? The first step is RRTK. The second step is start learning how to recognize words in sentences. And then the third step is eventually like read books and things like that or whatever. But so, yeah, I would say since your kanji comprehension and your kanji ability is going to be in such a kind of infancy stage right after finishing RRTK, you want to make sure you're jumping right into taking the next step so that you don't lose what you've gained through RRTK and you keep moving forward that process of learning how to read kanji. And the thing is, if you can read a word and know the reading, then as long as you're doing a lot of listening practice, learning how to hear that word is normally not very difficult. So I would say do lots of listening practice and do the text cards and have the audio on the back of the cards. So you're still going to get an opportunity to hear it pronounced. So your pronunciation should be fine, because every single time you review the card, you're hearing a native pronounce it. And that way you're mainly focusing on training your kanji recognition, because at the beginning you can't really read books yet. It's there's too many words that you don't know, but you can listen and you can watch things. So I'd say your listening ability is going to be pretty covered for your immersion, and because of that, you want to focus more on making sure that you're really cultivating your reading ability through the SRS. So yeah, I'd say just do text cards. If you have a lot of trouble recalling the readings, then first of all, that's normal. Being able to remember readings of kanji is a skill, and you're only going to get better at that skill through practicing the skill. So of course, you're going to be bad at that skill when you first start out. But I would say, so first of all, just set your expectations correctly. It's going to be difficult. Second of all, maybe set a low leech threshold on Anki, like maybe 5. Set a leech threshold of 5 lapses, so that if you get the same card wrong 5 times, it gets marked as a leech. And then maybe go in and edit out the kanji of the word that you can never remember in that card. And then you can still learn the sentence, but just not the kanji reading for that one card. And that's fine. Once your base level of kanji reading ability gets better, you'll naturally remember the reading of that kanji later on. So I would say, yeah, that's how I would deal with, if you're really struggling with the reading, then just change it to, like, either add furigana to it or just change it to kana, and don't let it slow you down too much. Okay, so Jeremy Gordon asks, I'm currently going through N4 Tango, and some kanji are becoming easy to read, but many still give me a lot of trouble. Is it just one of those things that very slowly improves until kana become easily readable? Or do you think that doing RTK traditional, it's funny, you keep reversing things. It's Tango N4, not N4 Tango, and it's traditional RTK, not RTK traditional. But anyway, I know what you mean. But do you think doing traditional RTK would soon would be helpful? I did RRTK and that helped, but I'm wondering when would be the best time to go back through traditional RTK, also called production RTK, if I feel I'm struggling with kanji. I don't do much reading practice other than Tango cards currently. So I think right now, going through production RTK and learning how to write all the characters, it would help you a little bit, but not very much, and definitely would not be a good use of your time. Because learning how to write all of the kanji out by hand before you're fluent in Japanese is extremely difficult and time-consuming, and also not very fun. And the thing is, doing traditional RTK or production RTK, you're not really training kanji recognition. You're training kanji production. And so if you're really struggling with kanji recognition, getting really good at producing kanji, I mean, normally if you can produce a kanji, you can also recognize it, so it's going to help you to a degree. But if you've already done RRTK, then the amount that it's going to help is probably going to be pretty minimal. So it's a few things that I would say. One is kind of like I just mentioned in the previous question. A lot of it is just expectations. Like you said, yeah, some kanji become easy for you to read, others not. So, I mean, yeah, that's just how it goes. Recognizing kanji is a skill. That skill gets better with practice. Before you've done many hundreds of hours of practice, your skill's not going to be very developed. And so it's going to be difficult. So, yeah, set a low leech threshold on your cards. When a card becomes a leech, either add furigana to the word that you were struggling with, or just replace it with kana. Don't worry about it too much. And the biggest thing I would say is start watching with Japanese subtitles. Because if you're watching with Japanese subtitles, then, like, it would say you spend half an hour to 1 hour a day watching with Japanese subtitles. That's 30 minutes to 1 hour each day that you're spending staring at kanji. And when a kanji comes up that you know because it's in your Tango deck, you're going to recognize it, you're going to hear it be pronounced, and then you're going to strengthen that memory a little bit. And also, a lot of, when it comes to getting better at recognizing kanji, a lot of it's just how many hours have you spent looking at kanji. And so that's going to help you as well, just get more familiar with the characters. And so I'd say if you haven't been doing any watching with subtitles, start doing that. That's going to help your kanji recognition a lot. But besides that, I'd say mostly just keep doing what you're doing. Reading kanji will get better and easier, and you'll get better and better at it with time. Have a low leech threshold, and just keep on going, because you're doing well and you'll get there. So Thomas Donovan asks, is there anything that can be done about having a low retention rate in Anki of vocabulary specifically when encountering it in the wild? My retention rate in Anki itself is about 89%, and I find most words to be fairly easy to remember on the cards themselves. However, my retention rate feels like it may be as low as 60% when coming across those same words in my immersion. My card layout is that the source picture plus full sentence is on the front with no furigana, and audio plus target definition plus furigana on the back. Almost all my cards are from anime or YouTube that I previously watched. So, first of all, this is a super normal thing. Basically, you're talking about how your retention is really great inside of Anki, But then when you come across those same words and those same structures in your immersion, you can't remember them very well. So if you watch my video called The Role of the SRS Part 1, I talk about how this is pretty much inevitable. Everyone who uses the SRS to learn a language experiences this. I experienced this, and it's not a problem. It's just how things are. And this is because memories become context dependent if you only recall them in the same context every single time that you recall them. So if you have a certain card or let's say you have a certain word, but the only time that you actually recall the meaning of that word is when you see it, when it's within a specific sentence on a specific card with a specific picture next to it, then you're only going to gain the ability to recognize that word when it's in that exact context. But when you see it in an entirely different context, in a different sentence, without the picture there to remind you about where that sentence came from, then you're not going to be able, you might not be able to remember it. And the metaphor that I like to use in order to kind of understand how this whole phenomenon is functioning is that of glow sticks. So depending on what country you're from, you might not know what glow stick is, or you might call it something different. But at least here in America, there's these things called glow sticks that you use on Halloween or when you go to a rave or something, where when you first get it, it's just this little thin tube that's like about this long, and it's either going to be green or red or blue, but it's going to be a very dull color. And then you break it and you bend it, and you hear this crunching sound, and you shake it up, and then it starts to glow, and then it might glow for like 10 hours or something. And what's happening really is that apparently there's a little piece of glass inside that's keeping two different chemicals separately, like they're keeping them from touching each other. And when you break the glass and the two chemicals mix, that's what creates the chemical reaction that causes it to glow. And then eventually it wears out 10 hours later. So I like to think of it as when you learn a word in Anki, you're creating a glow stick for that word, but you haven't broke it, like bended it and broke it up and shaken it up yet. And so it's not glowing yet. It's still dull. And the only way to really break it in and shake it up is to come across that actual word in your immersion a few times. And it's through doing that the memory goes from being context dependent to context independent. And when it's context independent, you can recall that word easily no matter what context you find it in, whether it's in your card or in a book or in a conversation or anything. And so I would just assume that it's going to take coming across a given word in your immersion 2 or 3 times before that memory is going to fully make the transition between context dependent to context independent. And so if you have a word in Anki that you always remember in Anki, but then you come across it in a book and you can't remember it, don't consider that a failure. Don't consider that as something going wrong. Think of it as, okay, cool. I just put a big bend in this word's glow stick, and 2 more bends from now, it's going to be glowing, and then it'll be good. And so that's just part of the process. That's just how it works. It's a limitation of the SRS, but in a way it doesn't really matter because it only takes 2 or 3 times of coming across that word in the wild before it becomes context independent. So it's really not that bad. And also, as you get better at the language in general, it will become easier and easier for you to transfer knowledge from Anki into real life. It'll get to the point where if you know it in Anki, you pretty much always automatically know it in your immersion as well, just because your meta ability to learn words becomes so high in that language. And so, yeah, mostly I would say you're not experiencing any problems. You just need to kind of reframe it differently in your head and see that everything's working perfectly. And the other thing is that personally, I would not put the picture on the front of cards because it's basically cheating, right? If you're making that memory even more context dependent than it would otherwise be, because every time you recall that word, you're shown an actual picture. And of course, we have very strong visual memories as humans. And so seeing a picture, that's a huge clue for our brain to know what part of our memory we should be heading towards to recall the answer, right? Like as soon as you see the face of a certain character making a certain expression, your brain's instantly going to know, oh, this is that card. And once it knows it's that card, it knows where in your memory to go. But if you didn't have that sentence, then you would have to actually read all of the words before your brain would be able to really know where to go to recall the meaning of the word. And to that extent, it would be less context dependent. So I think moving the picture from the front of your cards to the back of the card, it would essentially make your cards more difficult, which would mean that you would have to learn them to a higher standard in order to pass them, which would mean that when you walk away from Anki, you're going to know your words to a higher criteria, which means that they're going to be more context independent, and you're going to remember them more in real life. So yeah, I think moving that picture to the back of your cards will help to a certain degree. So Shkabak asks, I was wondering, given that you're familiar with the content, what the difference is between Hiikibiiki and truly natural speech are. Even though it's just two people talking, are there still elements that make it unnatural in any way? Or is Hiikibiiki about as close to natural speech as you can get when it comes to having a huge bank of content to listen to? What are your overall thoughts on the podcast? Yeah, so like I said in an earlier question in this Q&A, I have heard about this podcast called Hiikibiiki for a while, but I never actually listened to it until like an hour ago. So an hour ago, I went and downloaded a random episode and I started listening to it. And it's basically just a guy and a girl talking about random everyday stuff. So what I noticed was that it's completely natural Japanese. There's not really anything unnatural at all about it. They just sound like they're just having an unscripted conversation. All the usage is completely natural. They don't seem to be purposely dumbing down what the words that they use or the structures that they use or anything. It's a little bit slow. Like the speed at which they talk is a little bit slow, but I wouldn't say it's to the point where it's unnatural. There's not one natural speed that everyone talks at. There's a range of different speeds, and some people talk more slowly, some people talk more fast, and it also depends on the context, right? Sometimes when you have a lot of energy and you have a lot to say, you might talk more quickly. When you're more relaxed, you might talk more slowly. And so there's this range of natural speech, and I'd say they're still within this range of what is considered natural. It's on the slower end of this spectrum, but it's not so slow that it feels artificial. Like sometimes you hear learner podcasts where it's so slow that it's like, no one talks this slowly in real life. This is like artificially dumbed down. But I wouldn't say it's to that point. So in a way, yeah, it's completely natural. I found it pretty boring because I wasn't interested in what they were talking about. Like the two topics that I heard when I was clicking around, one of them, they were talking about keyboards and whether they like the keyboards that have like very thin buttons or whether they like the more mechanical type of keyboard. And the other conversation that I heard them having was something about some idol and about how some Japanese like female idol decided that she wanted to do something that idols don't normally do. So I didn't care about any of those, and they were just taking their time saying each opinion they had on the topic. So I wasn't really invested in any of the content. And so because of that, it was boring for me. So it might be boring for you, but it is definitely natural Japanese. And so that's definitely a huge plus. And another positive is it's very language dense, right? It's a podcast, which means that they're talking the entire time. So if you take like 1 hour of this podcast and think about how many words are you hearing within that hour, it's going to be much greater than if you took 1 hour of the average movie and counted up how many words you hear per hour, because the movie is going to have a lot of just dead time where there's an action scene or there's just some scenery or something happening on screen, but no one's talking. And so you're not actually getting any exposure to the language for those periods of time. So language density, it's going to be really good on that front. But a potential negative. Oh yeah. And then just, there's a lot of it. And so that's another positive, right? There's like probably hundreds of hours of this podcast now. Potential negative is that, first of all, there's no visual component. And so if you're a beginner, you might have no idea what they're talking about. And that will make it hard to learn from. Whereas if you're watching a movie, a benefit of the movie is you can probably tell roughly what's happening. At least you can to a degree, even if you don't really know that many words or you're not able to grasp that many words. And so that's one negative. And another negative is it might be really boring to you unless you happen to be very interested in whatever they're talking about. But I would say whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you depends on a lot of other factors that I covered earlier in this video. It kind of depends on what your overall game plan is and where you're at in the process. But I could see it being a really good useful resource for people who really want to be more focused on everyday natural language in the short term. It could be a good way to get into that, especially if you're a beginner. So those are my thoughts. So let's see. One more question, I guess. So Kleptomania asks, you said before that in theory, you could become fluent exclusively through listening from day one without looking up words or studying with things like Anki. Essentially, that you could trap someone in a room with a TV that played the target language and they'd come out fluent. Assuming you still believe this, do you think that the same applies to exclusively reading without any listening or other study? Again, if you trap someone in a room with nothing but target language books and the intention to read them, do you think it would be successful? If not, do you think that after a foundation, e.g. learning hiragana/katakana for Japanese, that it would then be possible? To me, it feels less intuitive that you could go from 0 to 100 with books compared to doing it with just visual mediums that could have inherent context clues, but this could be just due to my lack of first-hand experience and significant amounts of reading. Yeah, so I do think that if you just trapped someone in a room, like let's just say, for example, you trapped someone who knows no Japanese in a room, and you turned on a random Japanese TV station, and you just left them there for like 10 years, they probably would walk out fluent, assuming that they were paying attention to some degree to what was happening on the TV. But I think an important component of this is that it's the comprehensibility that I've mentioned multiple times in this Q&A. It's that there's a visual component on the TV that has some direct correlation to the language that is going to be coming out of the speakers of the TV, right? So if it's like a comedy show or something, then, someone's going to hit someone on the head and be like, kono boke ga. So maybe you can eventually realize that, kono boke ga, it means something about the guy doing something wrong or being stupid, because every time he says kono boke ga, he's like hitting him on the head or clearly seems to be angry or something. So there you have that. But if there was no visual and you just heard kono boke ga with like no context, you would have no idea what it meant. I mean, maybe you could try to gauge that it means something negative because the guy, the tone of voice of the person saying it would seem to be an angry kind of tone of voice. But really, if it was just audio with no visual component at all, I don't think it would probably be possible to acquire the language just through audio with no study at all. But I'm not positive, because people who are born blind still learn their native language with seemingly no issues. But again, that could be to other interactions that they're having with their environment through the senses, other than the visual sense. So I don't know how much of it is that the language acquisition center in the brain is so powerful that even without any visual stimuli, the brain of a child could still learn language, or if the other interactions through the other senses is necessary. I don't know, but I would say that as an adult, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to acquire a language just through audio without some sort of visual clue. But yeah, if you're talking about watching TV, I mean, it would depend on what the channel is, but in general, I'd say if you gave it enough time, you would be able to eventually pick it up, because there'd be enough of a correlation between what you're hearing and what you're seeing. But if you're talking about reading, assuming that you're not talking about a picture book, assuming that you're talking about like you just trap someone in a room who knows no Japanese and you just give them novels, then I don't think they would be able to learn pretty much anything at all, ultimately, if they had no dictionary and no prior knowledge. Because you just have nowhere to start, right? It's like you have literally nothing to work with. And so like you have to, it's kind of like if you think about the experiment of trapping someone in a room with a TV, the way that they would eventually go on to learn the language is kind of similar to solving a Sudoku puzzle. So when you start off with a Sudoku puzzle, I'm assuming that you know how Sudoku works. Look it up if you don't. But when you start off with a Sudoku puzzle, assuming it's a difficult puzzle, right? There's a small number of numbers already filled in, but the majority of the numbers are left blank. And you find some sort of space where you can add a number and deduce what the correct number is for that space based off the few numbers that are already given to you. And then once you add that one, well, now you have more to work with. You find another number that you can add, and you slowly work your way until you've figured out the entire Sudoku puzzle. So similarly, if there was some visual component, eventually you'd figure something out. Like maybe you figured out that sumimasen means like sorry or excuse me. Or maybe you figure out that konnichiwa it means like hello or like good day or something like that. Eventually, just through the visuals alone, you'd figure some stuff out. Once you have some stuff figured out, that would eventually help you figure some other stuff out. And eventually it would snowball until you're able to learn lots of words through context and things like that. But it all starts off with that first sumimasen or konnichiwa, right? There has to be something that you can figure out at the beginning of the Sudoku puzzle, right? Whereas if you're talking about reading, it's almost like you just gave someone a blank sheet and you're like, figure out the Sudoku puzzle. Well, I mean, but like, let's say that there was one exact answer for every number in every square, but you just gave them a blank one, right? It's going to be impossible for them to know which number goes in which square because, I mean, you could make a new puzzle that fits the requirements of a Sudoku puzzle. But if someone had a very particular Sudoku puzzle in mind and they just gave you a blank piece of paper, a blank Sudoku grid, and without telling you anything, they're anything other than like make the grid that I'm thinking of right now, you know, they wouldn't be able to do that. It would be impossible unless they just got amazingly lucky, like unrealistically lucky. So, but anyway, I think it would basically be a similar thing where if you have no pictures at all, there'd just be nothing, right? Like literally there'd be nothing to work with at all. So I don't think you could learn anything. But if, for example, you knew Chinese and you're trying to learn Japanese, I think you could do it. Or if you knew Japanese and you were trying to learn to read Chinese just through Chinese books, I think you could do that eventually. But again, that's because you have something to work with at the beginning. And even if you just learned hiragana or katakana, that wouldn't really do you any good because you wouldn't know any meanings, right? You would have no connection between the symbols on the page and meaning. You would only have a connection between symbols and sound, and that's not going to help you because learning how to read would ultimately require you to drawing connections between the visual characters and meanings. But interestingly, if you know about the site Antimoon, it's a site about these two Polish guys who learned English. It was the main inspiration for AJAT. One of those two guys, he once did an experiment where he tried to learn Norwegian just through reading Norwegian without ever using a dictionary or anything. And you can Google this and find it. He wrote about his experience on the web. You can find it probably pretty easily if you type in like learn Norwegian Antimoon or something. But he was able to get to the point where he could read Norwegian to a decent degree just through reading. And so this is kind of an experiment similar to what you're talking about. But again, he already knew English. And I don't know if Polish is related to English and related to Norwegian or English in any way. But either way, he knows English. And so it's similar to like the version of a Japanese person trying to learn to read Chinese just through text. So you're starting off with a huge base, right? So it's really not the same thing. So yeah, I would say if you have some sort of basis, like you already know kanji because you know Chinese or something like that, then you could, or you're trying to learn Spanish, but you already know English, then I think it'd be possible. It wouldn't be efficient, but it'd be possible. But if you really don't know anything about that language at all, then no, I don't think it would be possible. So yeah, that's it for this week's questions. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for supporting. Some exciting stuff coming up in the future. And I'll see you guys in the next one.